Hello everyone, welcome here again, here Elohim. For tonight I have this amazing guest next to me, that is Mhara Starling from Welsh. Is from exactly Chester, England. I think that is United Kingdom. I am a total ignorant of geography, so she will give us all the information that we need here. Uh, Mara is the author of Welsh Witchcraft, coming out this spring 2022. Uh, for the moment that you're watching this video, probably the book is available everywhere, in your bookstores, in Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, wherever you are looking for books. How are you doing, Mara?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me on. And yes, book coming out. Oh my goodness. Feels
Yeah,
strange to finally be here, finally seeing it in person and seeing it reach stores and readers' hands.
yes, I can imagine the feeling. I need to ask before go directly to the book. Do you live in Chester, England? Uh, in which part exactly do you live? I'm not gonna tell you, not physically because I'm not there, not yet. But in which city do you live, and which is your favorite thing about your city?
So I'm originally from a little place called Ynys Môn, which is in English the Isle of Anglesey. I'm originally from a tiny little village on the Isle of Anglesey where I lived for about 22 years. And I grew up in a very rural kind of Welsh speaking community, and it was in the middle of nowhere. And nowadays, I live in Chester in England. Chester is kind of like just on the border of Wales. It's literally, if I look down the street through my window, I can see the hills of Wales and I can see right through to North Wales. And there's still like a huge Welsh community here, but it is technically in England. So, yeah, my favorite thing about kind of I feel like I have this dual identity because I still go home a lot to Ynys Môn, to Anglesey, because my family still live there, but I live here right now with my partner. So I kind of have like this really strange relationship where I'm traveling up and down constantly between the two. Chester is my home base now because I live here full time, but I still like have such a strong connection to home because there's so much family there. And these two places, they're so strikingly different as well. It's like up on Anglesey. It's a very rural place. It's a coastal village that I grew up in called Aberfraw. And it's, like I said, a Welsh speaking community. So I speak my native language there first, my first language, which is Welsh. And it's such like a strikingly beautiful place and a place full of myth and legend. But in contrast, Chester, which is where I am right now, is just as beautiful and just as marvelous because it's a Roman city. So it's a walled city. It's really historical. There's a lot of beautiful historical sites here. We have an amphitheater. We even have like shrines and statues to goddesses and gods across the city and old temples, which can be found underneath coffee shops and things. So I think I have to speak about both because I see both as my home. And back home, what I love is the rurality and the middle of nowhere feeling. But here, it's the history and the feeling of there's this almost liminal feeling to Chester where it's like it's not quite Welsh, not quite English, somewhere in between, and it's such a historic and beautiful place. So yeah, I love getting to know the place that I'm in very intricately.
Yes, thank you for all the journey that you give us. Uh, I am a Spanish speaker. I'm pretty new in English. Exactly how, for people like me, or for people who talk English but don't know the difference, how exactly is different English from Welsh, from your native language?
Oh gosh. So Welsh is a Celtic language. It's a Brythonic Celtic language. So it's in the same family as languages like Irish and Scots Gaelic, but it's not quite exactly the same as them because we have a lot of differences. So the Celtic families are kind of split into two different branches. We've got the Brythonic and the Goidelic, which so under the Goidelic, you've got things like Irish Gaelic and Scots Gaelic. And then under Brythonic, you have Welsh, but you also have languages such as Cornish, which is they're very similar. So I always say to people, even though we're both Celtic, if, for example, I was speaking to an Irish person who spoke Irish as their language, I would not be able to understand anything they say, and they wouldn't be able to understand anything I say unless they speak Welsh. But if I'm speaking to someone in, say, Cornish, which is a bit of a lesser known language, just like Welsh, I suppose, but they are very similar to us, so we can understand each other. So family groups right there. I think Welsh is quite different from English. I remember when I was in university, there was a Greek girl who I was friends with called Effie, and she came over one day and said to me, well, you say you speak Welsh, but is that not just like a dialect of English, just like an accent? And I had to explain to her that no, it's actually like a completely different language. It doesn't sound anything alike to English at all. But it's really nice being bilingual because it means I can pick up on other languages a lot easier. So I speak Welsh is my first language. I was raised speaking Welsh in my home. My mother, my father, my siblings, they all speak Welsh as their first language. And they were very like passionate about the language as well, because if I went home from school and I started speaking to them in English because I'd been speaking English in class or something, my dad used to be like, don't speak to me with that horrible language. He was really like not into the English. So like I grew up quite privileged in the fact that I was so connected to my culture and the language of that culture, because in Wales, even though more and more people are starting to learn the language now, it's still a very minority language and it's not as widely spoken. We like to always kind of explain that Wales was kind of like the blueprint for British colonialism. So along with the Irish and the Scottish, we were some of the first people that the English kind of came over and colonized and changed over. And so because of that, there's a huge history of like the suppression of our language and our culture in favor of assimilating to British culture. And so nowadays there's this huge uprising trying to bring back our culture and trying to promote speaking the language. We're very lucky because Welsh was still very widely spoken throughout history, as opposed to, say, Irish, which for a long, long time diminished due to all sorts of historical reasons. But Welsh thrived consistently, and nowadays we have almost 1 million people who speak the language, and it's really lovely. But it is strange because here in Chester, like I said, it's such a liminal place where it's not quite English, not quite Welsh, it's on the border. So it's technically in England, but there's just such a huge amount of Welsh people in this city. So it's like I hear the Welsh language being spoken every day around me. And it's really nice to be able to connect to my culture in that way. And lately I've been doing a lot of work with like Welsh TV and things like that to promote my book. And I've noticed that I don't speak it as much as I should. So I only really speak it nowadays if I'm on the phone with my mum or if I'm chatting to someone, even though me and my partner, we both speak it fluently. He's second language, but he still speaks it fluently. We just don't speak it as often as we should really. And so lately I've been really trying to use it more often, both online and in person. But Welsh and English, very, very different. And I think that helps me connect to other cultures and other languages really easily as well. Um, yeah, so I'm really privileged to be able to speak both and dip my toes in both worlds.
Got it. Thank you for all of this information. Not just for me, I'm pretty sure that everyone who will listen to this will appreciate it. You have, and reading your biography, because now you're super famous. You have more than 1 million views on TikTok. Also, you was featured in the BBC Wales documentary series Young Welsh and Pretty Religious. All of this before have your book. How was this for you?
Oh gosh, I think Young Welsh and Pretty Religious, the BBC series, was the first thing I ever really did to put myself out there. I've been making kind of content online on Instagram and other places for a while now, but nothing really took off. I remember when I did Young Welsh and Pretty Religious, I was a bit of a nobody, like nobody knew who I was. And they approached me and they just wanted to do a really thoughtful documentary about what it's like to be religious in Wales. And the documentary actually follows numerous people from numerous faiths. So they had people from the Jewish community, they had someone who's Christian, they had Hare Krishnas, as well as like Muslims, everyone. And they kind of found me really late because they wanted someone who was a pagan, but they found it really hard to find someone who was both pagan and Welsh and was happy to go on camera to talk about it. So they found me really late. So I'm only in 2 episodes of the, I think it was 4-episode long series, but it was still really nice. And it was a way of like kind of bursting onto the scene. But I did that one, and then I did a few other things just on the side. And recently, like I said, I've been working with Welsh TV because of the book, but it's been really nice to work in Welsh instead of in English, because the Young Welsh and Pretty Religious was an English show. So it was nice to finally do some stuff in my native language as opposed to in English. But yeah, it's strange because TikTok kind of happened overnight. It was, I think I was bored during lockdown when the pandemic first started. And I went with my partner on a walk one day, and I'd already been doing videos on TikTok. I'd already been starting to do little videos, and I had about 2,000 followers at that point. And then I made a video about, I think it was about the legend of Llyna Van Fach, which is one of our like folk tales and fairy tales, which says that we have a tradition in Wales of herbal healing, which originates from a fairy. So according to our legends, a fairy gave the Welsh the ability to heal via herbalism. So I made a quick video just about that, about the fact that a fairy taught us how to heal people. And I made it in a really kind of campy storytelling kind of way because I was a bit all over the place that morning. And it reached like, I think that one reached 40,000 likes and had so many views. So the next morning I was like, screw it, I'm going to go over, I'm going to do another one to see if that does well as well. And I did another video in the same style about the witch hunts in Wales, because we have a really interesting history of witch hunts, which is a bit different to the usual narrative. And that one made over 1 million views. So it was kind of like, oh my gosh, it all happened just all at once. And I never expected it. I was just this little Welsh creator who just wanted to talk about my culture and talk about the stories of my land. And then the next minute I know, million views on TikTok, and I was just like, okay, oops. And what's funny is I'd already written the book at that point when my TikTok started taking off, and I'd already submitted it to Llewellyn, but I hadn't heard back from them because due to the pandemic, like they were taking a long time to get back to people because they had such like a huge amount of people submitting material, but also because they were off work as well because of the pandemic. So I was kind of using TikTok as a way to calm my nerves because I hadn't heard anything back from them about whether or not they wanted my book. And it did well in my favor, I think, because by the time they got back to me and said, yes, we want your book, they sent me a little questionnaire, which was like, tell us more about yourself. Like, what things can you tell us about yourself that will be an asset to the fact that you're trying to sell this book? And I was able to say at that point then, well, actually, I've just gathered over 100,000 followers on TikTok as well. And they were like, oh, great. Like, that's random. I was like, yeah, I don't know how it happened in about 2 months. So yeah, it was a strange experience, and it helped me kind of put myself out there and get the book promoted a little more. So that was good. And I think social media has definitely helped me flourish.
And we are very happy about it, and we are very happy for you, and we are very proud of you, and we are super proud of everything that you are doing and everything that you represent, and all the love that you put in every one of your projects. Now talking about the book, um, for the moment that we are talking, for the moment that we are recording this video, exactly the date that your book comes out in the United States is #1 in Celtic religions. That's a big thing. Tell me now about how was the process of the book for you? How was sit down, throw all of this information here? Because I was looking around before to talk with you, and I couldn't find many books or reference about Welsh witchcraft. So it's all very complicated for me. So how do you can put all of this concept of Welsh witchcraft for someone, and how was the process of the book for you?
Oh gosh, I always joke that I wrote the book in 3 months. I wrote the whole book just in 3 months. I sat down and I just mapped it all out, and within 3 months, it was all just done and dusted. But the truth is, like, even though I like to boast about, oh, I did it in 3 months, to feel special, the truth is, it took years, absolutely years, to get myself to a stage where I felt like I could write it. So when I was about 16, I met a lovely man called Christopher Hughes, who is also a Llewellyn author. He wrote books about Druidry and Welsh magic in particular. And I was fortunate enough that he lived literally down the street from me, like just down the road, when I was growing up on Anglesey, and he was the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order. And I remember when I met him, I'd already began my journey into witchcraft years prior, but my witchcraft was very focused on just this eclectic kind of mixture of all sorts of things and wasn't rooted in anything in particular. And when I met him, he kind of introduced me to a world of Welsh paganism, which was inspired and informed by our mythology, folklore, and just the magic of our land in general. And he really inspired me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I want to do that too. I want to start incorporating my culture into my magical practice, not just following kind of the standard eclectic form. I want to also honor my culture and my land as I do this. And that led me to kind of explore other authors such as like Gemma Gary and Nigel Pearson, who were writing about traditional witchcraft back then and still do today. I don't know why I said back then. And they wrote about specifically regional practices which were rooted in the places they were from. So Gemma Gary writes about Cornwall, and the way that she writes about Cornwall was really inspiring to me, because I was thinking while reading the books, like, surely we have this. She writes about like the traditions of cunning practice and folk magic that inspires her stream of traditional witchcraft today. And I thought, well, if Cornwall has a huge culture of folk magic and kind of this cunning tradition, surely Wales has something similar, something comparable. And that's when I started kind of exploring the Welsh kind of folk magical history and becoming inspired by it. And all the time while I was studying all this, Christopher kept telling me, you need to write a book. You should write a book about it, because nobody really has written a book about Welsh witchcraft, because he writes about magical traditions within Wales, but specifically from the perspective of a druid. And we just kept saying, well, I kept saying to him, I wish there was just one book, one little book that acted as a kind of introduction into Welsh witchcraft and folk magic and how to tailor your witchcraft to suit the landscape that we're in. And he kept saying to me, well, if you want it that badly, you need to write it. You need to write it yourself. And I think I pushed it off for so many years because I didn't see myself as good enough to do it. I was like, no, I'm not old enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not adequate enough to do that. And so I put it off and put it off and put it off. And then finally, when the pandemic came and I was sat at home doing nothing for months, I just turned around and thought, why not? Why not now? Let's just do it. And what was really a privilege for me was the fact that I had Christopher at my disposal. He was a wealth of knowledge. He was like a fountain of knowledge. Every time I thought, oh gosh, I can't find a reference or a piece of information to talk about this, I'd go to him and he'd always have something to bring to me. And then on top of that, I speak Welsh as my first language and I read Welsh very easily. So I could look into books that were not as commonly known because they were written purely in the Welsh language and published in like the 1920s or the 1800s. There's this one book in particular called Coelion Cymru, which was a huge kind of turning point for me in my practice and in my writing, because I opened the book and instantly it was written almost like this Christian priest was saying, oh, here are some of the superstitions and traditions of Wales that you should avoid. But then when I was reading it, I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is like an entire guide to Welsh magical traditions that nobody really ever talks about. And it's not very easy of a book to come across. I was very lucky to find my copy. And so I took kind of all these different books that I was finding. I was finding books that detailed the history of the witch trials and witchcraft in Wales, as well as books like Coelion Cymru, which talked about folk magical traditions. And I mixed them all together and infusing them together and also bringing in my own voice. So I also brought in the fact that I was raised in Wales. I have this connection to the land and the culture, and I have a lived experience of being a witch in Wales. So eventually that culminated in the book that I wrote. And it was a really nice process because not only was it my way of letting out everything that I've learned over the last decade or so, but it was also a teaching moment for me, because if at some point I was like, I don't really understand this concept enough, I don't really understand what this is all about, it was a chance for me to really dive into it deeper as well. So I'm really thankful for the boost in kind of confidence that 2020 gave me. Even if it was a terrible year, it was still a lovely time to kind of inspire a lot of people, I think, because it gave us the chance to slow down and think about what we wanted. So yeah.
This takes me to the next question. This is the deepest one. How was, in your own words, 2020 for you? This is, or 2020, 2021, these last 2 years. How was this for you?
I think I'm quite lucky because I'm very introverted, so I don't really like go out much. I don't do much. Well, I didn't, at least before the pandemic. I wasn't a very social person, and I didn't have very many friends because I'd only just moved to Chester as well. So I moved to Chester in 2018, and in that time I went traveling as well. So I hadn't become acquainted with Chester as a city yet, so I didn't have a group of friends here, and I didn't really do much in my day-to-day life. So it wasn't that big of a shift at first because I didn't really see much of a difference in my life. It was just that I couldn't go out as much now. The biggest thing was not being able to see family and not being able to go home, because like I said, I kind of live in both worlds at the moment. I travel between Wales and England, technically. I literally go on the train and within 3 minutes I'm in Wales, so it's not really traveling between, but it's still like I had this dual identity of living in Chester, but then going and staying with my mum and my family for long periods of time throughout the year. And I didn't get to do that for, I think, 2 years nearly. And that was really strange. And going back to the book for a second, it was really strange writing about Welsh witchcraft when I was not in Wales. It was like, the more I wrote the book, it was helping me connect to the culture and helping me like feel at home again. But at the same time, there were days when I was like writing this book and I was crying writing it because I was thinking, I want to go home and I want to go back and I can't. And it was really strange. And just before the pandemic hit as well, I'd started building a little bit of a community here in Chester. So when I was living on Anglesey, we had the Anglesey Druid Order, we had local moots, we had gatherings and rituals that we attended. And I had a little group of friends, a little group of witches that I met up with and did things with. We either practiced together or we'd go out for a drink or something and talk about things. And it was nice to have like a little community of witches who supported one another. So when I moved up here, I didn't have that. So in 2019, I started building like a little community of witches here in Chester as well. I started running classes and events at one of the local shops. And then 2020 hit just as they were like reaching their peak. It was like we started getting loads and loads of people interested. And I think it was in March of 2020 that we had this huge event planned for the next month. And then we were told, oh no, everything's going into lockdown. You need to cancel every event. You need to cancel gatherings. And it was really gut wrenching because it was like I spent so much time building this community and putting myself out there. As I said, I'm quite an introverted person, so I didn't really like putting myself out there, going into social situations. And I'd finally kind of overcome that and done it. And then the world shut down. And it was like, oh my gosh, here we go. Of course this would happen. But it was, like I said, a time for me to look inwards and reflect on what I wanted to do with my life. And it was a chance to write. And I think compared to most, I was quite fortunate in what happened during the pandemic, because I didn't suffer as most did, because I was fortunate to still have my partner who worked full time, and I still had the book that I could pour myself into. So it was kind of like not good, because obviously a pandemic is never good, but I'm glad that I got the chance to reflect, because it really made me consider what I wanted from life, because I was working in a job that I hated. And I'm glad that like the pandemic gave me a chance to step away from that and be like, I don't want to do that, I want to do this. So yeah, wasn't that terrible, but very transformative.
Yeah. Uh, Imagine this scenario. You are a time traveler. I give you the opportunity to make two travels. You can travel, you can do both. You don't need to choose one. You can go to the past 10, 14, 15 years ago, and you can go to the future 30, 40 years in the future. First, if you could go to the past 10 or 14, 15 years ago, which advice do you could like to give to yourself? If and when you go to the future, in 30, 40, 50 years, how do you like to see yourself in the future?
I think if I could go backwards in time, I'd have so much to say to myself. Um, so I remember when I was growing up in Wales, I didn't really, and I always feel scared to admit this to people, but I didn't like being Welsh. I didn't like the fact that I was Welsh. I thought it was a really strange thing, and I didn't have any pride in my cultural identity at all, because I associated my cultural identity with some of the things I was going through back then. So growing up in a really kind of rural, small place, and being outwardly queer, very outwardly and openly queer, it was quite difficult, because I didn't really feel acceptance at home. My dad didn't accept me for who I was and still doesn't. And then on top of that, I didn't really have any friends or anything like that, because I didn't fit the mold of what people wanted me to be. And I spent so many years blaming being Welsh on why this was happening. I was like, oh, the only reason I'm struggling with like homophobia and transphobia so much on a daily basis is because I live in the middle of nowhere. I live with all these like backwards country idiots who think they know everything. And I would literally despise the place that I was in. And I worked so hard to try and eradicate any kind of cultural tie I had. I remember when I was a teenager, I kept saying, I can't wait. I can't wait to leave. I can't wait to move to a big city somewhere instead of living in this silly little village where everybody knows everyone. And I'm going to like leave my culture, my language behind. I don't need it because it's just held me back. And now I look back at that and I'm like, you were so stupid for doing that. Like, it was not your culture or the land that you were on that was to blame. It was a few small-minded idiots who tried to make your life a living hell just because they were insecure about their own lives. And I wish I could go back and tell myself, like just immerse yourself in it all. Because one of the biggest comments I have, and this is not in any way justifying those comments because they're silly, but I always get told, like, especially now that I kind of put myself out there and I have a bit of an audience watching me, I sometimes get comments from people who come onto my videos and they're like, I don't believe that you're Welsh because you don't sound Welsh, you sound English to me. And it's like, yes, because I trained my accent away. I literally, at I think 14 or 15, I hated the fact that I sounded Welsh and I trained it out of me. I used to take acting courses and things. So learning to speak in a different accent was something that I've been doing since I was 14. And now it's really hard to go back into my original accent. It's really hard to like switch back into it. It only really happens now when I'm speaking Welsh fluently, or if I spend a lot of time in Wales and I switch to English quickly, the accent comes out. But now, if I'm speaking in English, it just does not come out unless I try and force it to, which is really sad because I miss it. I remember I have a few videos on YouTube from when I was like, I think 13 or 14 from before I started training the accent away. And I watch those videos sometimes, or I watch some of the home videos I had from when I was younger. And I think, oh my gosh, I loved my accent. It was great. Like it was really tied to the land. And I hear like my mum's voice and my grandmother's voice in my voice when I speak. So I trained that away. I trained it away to try and sound like some Hermione Granger wannabe. And it just, I wish I could go back and tell myself to immerse myself in the land and immerse myself in the culture, because once I did, once I kind of accepted, you know, I am Welsh and I'm allowed to be Welsh and I'm allowed to love my culture just as much as any straight cis person who lives in this country as well, I flourished within my practice. I flourished within my mental well-being because I felt this connection to the land. So that's one of the biggest things I'd tell myself, is to go back and say, number one, have better self-worth, because don't let these idiots who try and tell you that you're wrong or shouldn't exist make you feel like that. Stop giving them so much attention, really, and permission to walk all over you. And two, like, really delve into your culture. Stop being ashamed of it. And yeah, I hope that if I was to go into the future, I would see that I have embodied those things. And I think I've started doing it a lot more now. I mean, I'm known online as a Welsh witch now. So I think nowadays I've embodied my culture, and I do have much more self-confidence in who I am and acceptance for what and who I am. So I hope that if I were to go into the future, that I'd still be just as happy as I am now, and just as openly explorative in nature when it comes to my culture and my identity.
Thank you for that. Another scenario. I go into this store. I find your book. You are in there. Uh, any of the vendors are attending me, and I take the book in my hands, and I ask uh, what I will learn from this book, how or why I should buy this book. What do you say to me?
First and foremost, I think I'd ask, do you have any interest in Wales? Do you have any interest in Welsh traditions? Because if you do, there's plenty of them in here. But even if nobody, even if somebody who does not have an interest in Wales picks up the book, I like to hope that there's still something in here that they can take, because this isn't just, you know, I wrote a post recently which kind of explained what the book is actually about, because I was seeing a lot of people being confused about what it was. There was a few people who thought it was a history book, a book like delving into the history and academic study of witchcraft in Wales, and it's not that. And then other people saying like, oh, it's a real like full-on guide to how to practice Welsh witchcraft, and it's going to teach us about this old ancient tradition. And it's like, it's not that either, really. It's more so just my exploration of how I incorporate folklore, mythology, and Welsh history into my own personal practice, and how I made it my own. But in there, I talk about, you know, connecting to the landscape that you're on. I talk about the importance of acknowledging where you are in the world and what spirits are around you. I talk about my personal exploration of like how, as a queer person, I often heard, you know, people say in the past, oh, labels don't matter, we shouldn't label ourselves, they're so restrictive. But in saying that, as a transgender woman, like finding terminology and labels that I could gel with, that I felt comfortable associating with myself, was actually transformative for me and helped me to accept myself. So there's a huge discussion in there about, you know, are labels actually as restrictive as we say they are? And also just there's a lot of exploration of, you know, coming to terms with being a witch, and how to tie that into your cultural background, and how to tie that into your regionality, like where you are in the world. So even if you have no interest in Welsh legend and lore, I still think there's something in this book that you could take away for yourself. And I hope that it will inspire people to look around them at their locale, rather than just taking whatever they want from all over the world. Instead, looking at at their doorstep, looking what's right there on their doorstep and what is in their history, their culture, and understanding, what is culture to begin with. Because I think sometimes we get confused about, like, we associate culture with like race or blood, when it's not. Culture is lived. It's what you live. Whatever you are living right now is your culture. And sometimes that can be really transformative in helping you construct a spiritual or magical pathway.
Thank you. I like to make this question because in that way I can pick up a little bit of the mind of the author, the writer, and the human being behind the book. If I look a little distracted, it's because I was watching that your book is in this moment. I'm really happy for this. Your book is in United States is number one in paperback in the Celtic traditions, and it's four in Kindle. I mean, the paperback is number one and the Kindle is number four, both in the bestseller list of Celtic religion. That is pretty awesome because it's a reflection of all your work, and it's a reflection also of how many people in other parts of the world that no are next to you, they are feeling identified with your work, and that's beautiful.
Oh gosh, I think I've been a bit overwhelmed by the reaction, because I genuinely thought that the book was just kind of going to be. I wrote it, like I said, for myself, because like Christopher told me, like, if you want that book so bad, you need to write it yourself. So I wrote it for myself, thinking, if maybe there's a future person who is like young Mara, who wanted that book so badly, there will be something for them. And I didn't write it with the intention of, like, oh, I'm going to sell a bunch of copies and I'm going to make lots of money or anything like that. It was literally written with the intention of just recording what it is that I do and trying to add a voice to an area of study that isn't really saturated yet. There's not that many people who talk about, like you said, Welsh studies. There's not that many people who talk about the Welsh cultural continuum in terms of witchcraft and magic. So I wanted to add my voice into the mix before it gets saturated, or to help people who don't know where to start find their way. And so when, like I said, when TikTok blew up and social media blew up, I was really shocked. And recently, I think my publicist got in touch with me and said, hey, you do realize that we've sold through all the first prints, like we're going into a second printing before it's even out. And I was just like, what? Why? Like, how has this happened, and why are people so interested? And I do have like moments of severe kind of imposter syndrome where I'm like, oh god, like, is this even as good as like I'm making it out to be? Like, what if people get it? And this is the panic that's going on right now because it's coming out like this week in America. I'm like, what if people read it and they're like, it's terrible, you are a fraud, you're horrible? And I think every author goes through that. I'm sure you can relate, maybe. But yeah, it's really strange. It's scary putting yourself out there.
I imagine. I have two silly questions for you. The first one is, do you remember or do you recall your first book on witchcraft and magic?
Well, I do. I can't remember what the author is called, but it was a tiny little book. It was like the size of a pamphlet, and I found it in a secondhand bookshop in a little town called Llangefni. And I remember I was I think 11 years old or 12 years old, one of them. And I was out with my mother, and she was shopping for clothes. And I went into this secondhand shop, and I found a little book called Spells for Teenage Witches, and it was this little yellow book that had a bunch of spells and magical rituals. And I remember back then thinking, oh, maybe this is like a fantasy book. Maybe this is like something I can get myself into. So I bought it and then I took it home, and it was just this guide of like how to live like a witch, how to make your own wand, how to set up your altar, how to cast a spell to make friends, how to, banish negativity from your life. And I started doing the things in them, and it really started transforming my life. Before that, I was already inspired by like the folklore and myth and legend of my land, and my grandmother used to read like tea leaves and the crystal ball and things. So I was already kind of surrounded by magic, but finding that book was my first step in kind of putting into words what it was I was doing. And after that, that book was like really influential in my early years. But then I think the first book that I was really seriously reading and like trying to study was The Real Witch's Handbook by Kate West. That was the first one I found, again, in a secondhand bookshop. And I was like, this is what I want to be. I want to be a witch like these people are. But yes, the Spells for Teenage Witches was a silly little book, but it helped me get to where I am. So I'm very grateful for it.
Got it. And did you remember which was your first spell or ritual that you did?
Yeah, I do. I remember when I was very young, I still like just as today, I struggled with like communicating with people and making friends and being myself, being authentically me and having people like me. And I remember in the Spells for Teenage Witches book, there's a spell to make friends, to like, you know, to attract friends towards you and to make a best friend for life and things like this. And I remember I followed that spell to the T. I followed it like so like religiously because I really desperately wanted to make friends. And I think after I did the spell, I met a group of girls who I became friends with. And I can't remember now if I put it down to, because it didn't happen straight away. It wasn't like I did the spell and the next day I made friends. It was more like a month or two later. So I was like, oh, it's just a coincidence. And I kind of wrote it off. And then a few months, well, not a few months, a few years later, I remember everyone was, I think when I was about 14, going on to 15, everyone in my friend group was getting like boyfriends and starting to date. And I was the only out gay kid at school back then. Before I came out as trans, I was out as like gay and putting myself out there. And I remember I went back into the book and looked at the like friendship spell, and I was like, maybe I can adapt this and make it so that I can attract a boyfriend. And I ran out to I lived like on the coast. I ran to the cliffs around my home, and I went and stood on this place called a peak, which is this like peak of rocks that look out to the Irish Sea. And I stood there in the wind and I did this spell, but I changed it. So instead of friends, it was like, help me get a boyfriend. And it was like so cringy, so teenager. But it worked because literally 2 weeks later, I met this guy called Matthew, and we're still together to this day. So it was like that first spell I did, the friendship spell, I remember it so vividly because it was such a poignant part of my life. And then later on, I went and adapted it to try and get a boyfriend. And I still like laugh at the fact, like, I don't know if it's the spell that made it happen, but something happened and it was really nice.
Oh, really works. But I don't have more questions for you. Has been a wonderful time with you. I love connect with you. I hope that we can connect even more in the future. Do you have something or anything that you want to share for your followers and readers that they are a lot?
Well, obviously, the book comes out this week. So if you haven't pre-ordered already, do pre-order that. But this year, I'm also going to be doing a lot on my Patreon and over on YouTube as well. So I think I have most of my followers follow me over on TikTok, which is great. But TikTok is like short form and I don't get as much time to go in depth into it. YouTube was where I started doing a lot of sharing a lot of this Welsh knowledge. And I don't have very many people who watch over there, but I do have this like little tight-knit group of people who still follow me from 2019 or whatever it was that I started making videos there. And this year I'm going to be posting at least 2 videos every month on there. And I'm also going to be doing a lot more over on Patreon, which of course is paid. And I don't want to like pressure people into doing that, but I do have tiers as low as £1 a month. So that's like a place that I'm going to be sharing a lot this year as I write, hopefully, my second book.
For everyone looking for information about my friend Mara, uh, all the links that she's mentioned is below in the description of this video. Her book, website, TikTok, YouTube, everything. Look for her, follow her, support her, stalk her a little bit, but not in a dangerous way, please. And remember, please share this kind of books with someone else. Please try to recommend this kind of book, this kind of work, because our community continue growing, but we continue being a very small group. We are a very diverse group. We really like each other. We really try to create connections. So if you help your content creators or your authors or your bloggers, you are giving support to the whole community. And we are growing thanks to you. Thank you, Mara, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was great talking to you.
Yes, I hope we can repeat this very soon. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Blessings to everyone. Be kind, be wild, stay safe, and stay well, and be kind with everyone else. Bye.